"Don't tell me you invited him to the wedding?" someone whispered, just loud enough for the bride to hear. As the old man in the worn-out suit stepped through the church doors, silver hair combed back, shoes scuffed but polished, eyes steady beneath deep lines of time. Dozens of heads turned away, uncomfortable, uneasy. But Emily didn't flinch. She didn't apologize. She lifted her gown, walked past the altar, and wrapped her arms around him, as if he were her own father. No one understood, until the church doors opened again. 12 Marines in full dress uniform marched in silent formation, each step echoing through marble and disbelief. Their gloves white, their faces solemn, their salute precise. Not for a general, not for a groom, but for the quiet woman who fed a stranger every morning without asking his name. And in that moment, silence spread wider than judgment, and honor replaced whispers. Watch what happens when kindness meets a uniform it never expected. Comment honor if you believe some salutes are earned, not in battle, but in bakeries before sunrise. For those who still believe in invisible acts that save visible lives, this story is yours. Emily Rosas was 30 years old. But there was a kind of stillness in her movements that made people think she was older, like someone who had lived through quieter wars of the heart. Her dark brown hair was always tied back in a low bun, flour often dusting her sleeves before sunrise. She wasn't beautiful in a way that drew attention, but there was a warmth in her eyes, a steadiness in the way she handled things. Dough, trays, people, that made her unforgettable to those who looked twice. At 4:30 every morning, she slipped into Sunrise Bakery in downtown San Diego, unlocking the doors before the sky turned pale, the ovens humming like old friends waiting to be fed. For 6 years, she'd been the head pastry chef, known not just for croissants that melted on the tongue, but for a quiet precision, never rushed, never distracted. She paid for her own extra ingredient, always made one more, and always wrapped it. One warm pastry, one cup of black coffee, one handwritten note, then slipped out the back door and placed them on the same wooden bench near the bus stop. She never spoke of it, never asked his name. The man she fed never begged. He sat upright in a tattered coat, silver hair tangled by the breeze, hands folded like someone raised on discipline and silence. Her co-workers whispered, some with pity, some with disdain. Why waste food on a stranger who won't even say, thank you? The new manager, a man who liked spreadsheets more than stories, told her it made customers uncomfortable. Emily nodded, but changed nothing. She simply arrived earlier, wrapped faster, and walked with softer steps. She lived alone, in a quiet apartment 2 blocks from the bakery, with a small shelf of cookbooks, one framed photo of her late father in uniform, and a stack of thank you notes she never sent. She was engaged to Marco, a firefighter with gentle hands and tired eyes, who never questioned why she left every morning before dawn. You always find the invisible people, he once said, smiling. But not everyone saw it that way. One cold morning, as Emily returned from the bench, a younger coworker scoffed just loud enough for her to hear. She's been feeding that bum for years. Emily didn't look up, but for the first time, the words pierced something soft inside her. And as she rolled out the dough that morning, the sky outside still dark, a strange heaviness settled in her chest, like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting. The new girl at the bakery had only been working there a week when she said it, loud enough for a customer to hear, louder still for Emily to feel every word land like a stone in her chest. She's been feeding that bum for 5 years, every single day. The customer glanced toward the back door, where Emily had just returned, wiping her hands on her apron, her face flushed not with shame, but with the heat of the ovens. Something else, something heavier. The woman shook her head slowly, lips pressed in judgment. Poor thing, she whispered, thinking she's making a difference. Neither of them knew Emily had heard. Neither of them cared. No one spoke up. No one said, "That's not fair," or "She's just being kind." The manager walked past them both with a clipboard and a sigh, as if compassion were a smudge on the bakery's polished reputation. Emily said nothing. She didn't defend herself. She didn't explain the extra minutes she carved from sleep to knead one more batch of dough, or the quiet way she folded those notes. Always in the same pen, always with the same 3 words: "Wishing you peace." She simply turned back to her station, picked up her rolling pin, and kept going. But her hands trembled that day. Just slightly. Just enough for her to notice. That night, she walked home slower than usual. The early winter air had a bite to it, but she didn't pull her coat tighter. Her mind replayed the words again and again like a bad song she couldn't turn off. Feeding that bum. Thinking, she's making a difference. They weren't just cruel. They were careless. The kind of cruelty that came from people who had never once looked that man in the eyes and seen what she saw. Not a problem. Not a burden. But a presence. A life still breathing. The next morning, the bench was slick with rain. The old man sat with his coat buttoned to the neck, his hands tucked beneath his arms, shivering against the cold. Emily hesitated just a moment longer than usual, then gently set the pastry down. And then, without planning it, she reached into her bag and pulled out the only scarf she owned that wasn't from a thrift store. A worn wool wrap the color of red clay. She placed it next to the coffee, not meeting his eyes, just a soft nod before walking away. The next day, the napkin returned. But this time, it held more than crumbs. On the back, written in trembling pencil, were 8 words. "Thank you for seeing me as a person." Emily stared at it for a long time before folding it neatly and slipping it into her wallet. She didn't tell anyone. Not Marco. Do. Not her coworkers. But something changed after that. Something unspoken. Her eyes lingered longer on the street corner, outside the bakery. Her footsteps grew quieter. And when she smiled, it never quite reached her eyes. 1 week later, a letter arrived at the wedding venue, unmarked, hand-delivered, addressed only to the bride. Inside was a single line, inked in careful cursive. "Tomorrow I will come not for cake, but to honor a debt." No name. No return address. And when the church doors finally opened, the morning of the wedding carried an eerie stillness, like the air itself was holding its breath. Emily stood in the bridal room, dressed in white, her fingers trembling not from nerves, but from the memory of a note slipped beneath the door, just 2 nights earlier. "Tomorrow I will come not for cake, but to honor a debt." She hadn't shown it to anyone. Not Marco, not her mother. It wasn't fear that made her keep it secret. It was instinct. Whatever it meant, it wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Outside the stained glass windows, guests gathered, brushing snowflakes from their coats, heels tapping across stone. Then, across the courtyard, a figure emerged. Alone, upright, unmistakable. The man from the bench. Dressed in a suit decades out of style, shoulders squared, silver hair combed, shoes cracked but shine. His hands rested calmly at his sides. His eyes searched for no one. Still, the whispers found him. "Is he lost?" someone said. She invited him to this. Emily didn't wait. She gathered her skirt and walked, past shocked bridesmaids, past a frozen usher fumbling his program, until she reached the front steps. He didn't speak. Neither did she. She only reached for his coat, eyes misted. "I remember your eyes," she whispered. His face broke into a smile. Small, soft, but carrying the dignity of someone once saluted. "And I remember every morning you treated me like a person," he said, steady and sure. And then, the low hum of engines. One SUV-IT. Then, another. Then a third. All black. No markings. They rolled to a stop with slow precision, as if time itself obeyed their pacing. Doors opened. 12 Marines stepped out. Dress blues, pressed creases, medals polished. Their movements were perfectly synchronized, not a glance wasted. The courtyard fell silent. A fork dropped. No one bent to retrieve it. At the front was a man with a square jaw, weathered face, and a nameplate that read Duncan. His boots struck the pavement like thunder held back. He approached with quiet force, stopped in front of the old man, and raised his right hand in a sharp, unwavering salute. "Ma'am," he said to Emily, not breaking form, "I believe you've been standing guard longer than we ever did." Then he turned, eyes locked on the man beside her. "Sergeant Hale, Alpha Company, 3rd Battalion. Reporting for duty, sir." And in that still moment, without a single raised voice, without a single command, everyone knew this wasn't just a wedding anymore. Something sacred had just arrived. The church didn't breathe. Even the candle flames seemed to pause, flickering as if unsure whether to burn brighter or go out entirely. The air held a weight, a tension that bent sound and stillness into something brittle. And then, like a fault line finally shifting, someone cleared his throat. It was the man from earlier, the one who had whispered loud enough to wound. He stood now near the center aisle, arms crossed, tie loosened, smirking like a boy caught mocking the wrong teacher. "So what now?" he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "You throw a suit on a bum and call him a hero? Maybe I should skip shaving next week and wait for a parade too." Nobody laughed. Not even the cousin who had chuckled earlier. Not a soul moved. Captain Duncan turned. Slowly, deliberately. His boots didn't stomp. They landed. With purpose. With weight. His eyes locked on the man like radar. Unblinking. He said nothing. Just walked. 12 slow paces, until the space between them held nothing but silence and shame. "You think you know what a uniform is," Duncan said, voice low, measured, the kind of calm that made every heartbeat feel like thunder. "You think it's medals and speeches and parades." He held up a small photo, weathered, curled at the edges. "You ever seen this?" He handed it to the man without breaking gaze. It was a photo, grainy, black and white, but unmistakable. A younger Victor Hale, hauling a wounded Marine across rubble-strewn ground. And behind him, barely visible, was Duncan himself, legs torn open, eyes wide with pain. "That's Fallujah," Duncan said. 2004. He carried me 4 blocks through open fire, then went back. 8 more times. He was hit twice. Never stopped. Duncan's voice didn't waver. "This isn't a suit. It's a story. And you don't get to rewrite it." The man looked down at the photo, lips parted, smile gone. "You mocked a man you don't have the spine to thank," Duncan continued, voice quieter now, but cutting deeper. "And if not for him, I'd still be in that dirt, or under it." No one in the room moved. The air felt wrapped in frost. Emily stood frozen beside Victor, her hand still gently resting on his arm, her eyes fixed on the moment, like it was holding something sacred. Even the pastor didn't speak. This was no longer a wedding. This was a reckoning. The man's jaw tightened. He looked up, only to meet Duncan's eyes again, and this time, something shifted. Not in Duncan's face, which remained still as stone, but in the other man's. A crack in the sneer, a flicker of something sharp and unwelcome. Recognition, and beneath it, fear. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Captain Duncan didn't need to raise his voice. He simply turned toward the crowd, held up the photograph one last time, and this time he let it fall. The image drifted to the floor between polished shoes and velvet pews, and landed face up where anyone could see it. But what followed wasn't a speech. It was a name. Victor Hale. Silver Star. Never claimed. The silence fractured. A bridesmaid gasped. One of the ushers, the one who had laughed earlier, took a step back, as if distance might protect him from the shame. Even the organist, seated with both hands clenched in her lap, lowered her gaze. And then, another voice. "Come, long." Low, dull way. Male toit. From the back of the church. I served with him, the man said. All eyes turned. It was a Marine in civilian clothes, older, stockier, with a limp that told its own story. He stepped forward, holding a folder. I was there the day they pinned it on him. He disappeared before they could hand it over. Duncan took the file, opened it carefully, and pulled out a medal. Not new, not polished. Worn with time, like it had waited years to be acknowledged. He held it in his gloved hand, walked toward Victor, and placed it, without ceremony, into the older man's palm. You earned this, he said. Victor looked at it but said nothing. The man who had mocked him, the one who had laughed, belittled, sneered, was no longer smiling. He glanced left, then right, looking for a corner to disappear into. His hands were at his sides, twitching with nerves he couldn't hide. I didn't know, he muttered. I thought he was just— No, Duncan cut in, voice like steel dragged across granite. You didn't think, you judged. From the edge of the aisle, a woman whispered, We all did. And the shame spread like a cold wind. Emily remained silent, her eyes locked not on the man, but on the others, on her co-workers, her friends, the ones who had laughed at her notes, dismissed her kindness. And one by one, faces dropped. Some turned away. Some blinked hard. But no one spoke. And then the final weight fell. The Marine who brought the file turned toward the man and said quietly, You said he didn't look like a hero. But I watched him drag a bleeding teenager from a collapsed checkpoint with one good arm. That teenager was my brother. The man swallowed. Hard die. His face drained of color. Behind him, a quiet figure approached. An off-duty officer in dress uniform. Not part of the wedding. Not even invited. But watching. Always watching. Sir, he said, placing a hand gently but firmly on the man's shoulder. I believe it's time you left. No cuffs. No fight. Just a moment. Held long in silence, as the man lowered his head, turned, and walked out the door alone. And this time, no one watched him leave. The pews creaked. Not from movement, but from the weight of breath being held too long. The man who had mocked Victor was gone now, escorted out without resistance, without sound. And yet, what lingered in the sanctuary was not triumph, but reckoning. A bridesmaid, one who had whispered behind her hand earlier that morning, rose slowly from her seat. She didn't speak, just stepped toward Victor and knelt, offering the handkerchief from her bouquet. Her eyes were rimmed red, and when she placed it into his hand, her lips barely moved. I'm sorry. Victor didn't reply. He didn't need to. His hands, weathered, calloused, closed gently around the cloth like accepting a folded flag. Behind her, one of the bakery co-workers, Jenna, the loudest of them all, stood up stiffly. She clutched a paper bag in trembling fingers. You always made one extra, she murmured, eyes fixed on Emily. Now, I know why. She placed the bag beside Victor's chair. A cinnamon roll inside, still warm. The pastor didn't speak. The organist didn't move. Yet something had shifted in the room. Not a wave, not a speech, but a slow, collective inhale, like a town remembering how to breathe with its heart. One by one, guests stepped forward. A young man, in military dress, offered his seat. A teenage girl in a flowered dress pulled a metal pin from her purse, her grandfather's, and pressed it into Victor's palm. No cameras, no applause, just shoes on marble, and silence. Emily watched it all from a few steps away, veil still draped behind her, gown pooling like snow around her boots. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She only looked at Victor, then past him, toward the sunlight, slanting through the stained glass. I never fed a hero, she said softly, her voice low but clear. I fed a man. That was always enough. No one answered. but several heads bowed, not in prayer, but in something deeper. Remorse, recognition, respect. Captain Duncan turned toward the altar and removed his white gloves. "Alpha Company will stand outside until the ceremony is complete," he said quietly. "He deserves a guard of honor, and she," he glanced toward Emily, "deserves to walk without shame." The Marines filed out without command, forming a silent corridor beneath the winter sun. Their boots fell in perfect rhythm, not to intimidate, but to uphold. Inside, Emily stepped forward, took Victor's arm once more, and together they walked down the aisle, not to music, but to memory. And as they passed, even those who had turned away earlier stood. No one told them to. It simply felt right. By the doors, Marco waited. No rush in his eyes, only pride. As he took Emily's hand, Victor paused, turned back to look at the room that had once refused to see him. "This place used to feel like a shelter," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it can be again." The bakery changed first. Not overnight. Not loudly. But one morning, weeks after the wedding, a small wooden frame appeared on the wall above the bench outside, coated in matte black, the kind that doesn't glare in sunlight. Inside, behind thick glass, was a folded napkin. The handwriting on it, faint but still legible, read, "Thank you for seeing me as a person." No name. No caption. Just a brass plaque underneath, "For those we overlook too easily." Customers stopped. Not to take selfies. Just to look. Inside, beside the register, a second frame held a photograph of Emily and Victor, taken candidly from the side. No poses. Just the way her hand rested on his arm, and the way he stood straight, not as a homeless man, but as a Marine once more. Beneath it, a line was etched into the wood. "Everyone has a story. Some carry theirs in silence." No announcement had been made. No ceremony held. It had been Jenna who quietly placed it there, one early morning before anyone else arrived. She didn't explain. She didn't need to. Elsewhere, the ripple widened. A high school civics teacher told the story during a Friday morning assembly, not to lecture, but to ask a question. What makes a hero visible? A student rose, mid-assembly, and replied, "Who's sitting alone at lunch right now?" That day, 6 lunch tables in the cafeteria shifted. Quietly, veterans began stopping by the bakery, not to be fed, but to leave things. A ribbon, a coin, a photograph, all placed at the bench out front. Nobody disturbed them. By mid-month, a small glass case had been added beneath the wooden frame to hold the mementos, the way a museum might hold pieces of a forgotten war. Victor never spoke at these moments. He came early, before sunrise, stood at a distance. Sometimes he would touch the glass. Sometimes he would simply nod, then walk away. But always with his back straight, the weight of years now shared, no longer carried alone. Emily said little, too. But when a young boy approached her once, wide-eyed, holding a drawing of a Marine in full gear, she knelt beside him and asked gently, "Is that your dad?" The boy shook his head. "It's your friend. I want to be like him." One afternoon, a group of teens came to volunteer. No news cameras. No sponsors. Just a request. "Can we help clean the bench?" By late spring, a new sign had been carved into the awning that shaded the storefront window. It didn't bear a slogan or a name. Just 2 words, "Quiet Table." Victor never asked for the bench. Never asked for the sign, the photo, the frame, or the stories, but they came anyway. Not because he demanded them, but because he didn't. And on the days when no one lingered, no one donated, no one spoke, he still came, still stood, still nodded. And in that small gesture, so easily missed by those passing by, something lasting remained. In the quiet hour just before sunrise, the bakery lights hummed to life, but not for business. The storefront remained closed, the chairs still upside down on tabletops. Inside, only two figures sat at the corner booth by the window. Victor and Marco. No uniforms. No cameras. No ceremony. Just a father-in-law and his son-in-law, facing each other with two steaming mugs between them. One held black coffee. The other, warm milk and a hint of cinnamon. The street outside was still empty, save for the occasional sweep of a bus in the distance. The world hadn't yet begun its noise. Inside, the silence was different. Not heavy. Not awkward. Just the kind of silence that comes when nothing more needs proving. Victor held his mug without drinking, thumb resting along the chipped ceramic as if tracing time. His eyes, though still clouded from years of carrying pain alone, had softened, just slightly. Marco, seated across from him in a faded Firehouse t-shirt, leaned forward with both elbows on the table. He didn't speak for a long while. Then, without looking up, he said, "Didn't think I'd need you again." Victor looked at him, not startled, not confused, just present. "I didn't think I'd need anyone," he answered, voice low. "But then, she found both of us." They didn't smile, but something passed between them. Not a joke, not agreement, something older. A truce, maybe. Or the quiet relief of being seen by someone who doesn't expect an apology. Marco reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a simple folded cap, the kind Marines wore before dress blues. It was worn, sun-faded. He slid it across the table without a word. Victor took it, turned it in his hands. He didn't put it on. Just held it the way one might hold the past. Not to return to it, but to honor that it was real. Outside, a faint breeze stirred the quiet table's wooden sign. Inside, a clock ticked softly overhead. Somewhere in the kitchen, the automatic mixer clicked on briefly, then fell silent again. Victor's voice, when it returned, was quieter still. "You chose her," he said, almost to himself. "That means you choose what matters." Marco didn't answer. He just reached over, placed a hand gently on Victor's shoulder. Not firm, not soft, just steady. Across the table, two mugs cooled. No one sipped. No one rushed. The sun edged higher, casting long amber shadows across the tiled floor. And still, neither of them moved. A truck passed outside. A dog barked 2 blocks down. But inside, nothing shifted. Not until Marco stood and Victor followed, neither one saying it was time. They walked to the front door together. Marco opened it. Victor paused, looked once more at the photo on the wall. The one of him and Emily, sunlight catching the corner of her smile. Then he nodded. Once. And together, they stepped out into the morning. In the months that followed, the story of Victor Hale drifted quietly beyond the bakery's awning, past the block where the quiet table stood, past the sidewalks where people once hurried by him with averted eyes. It found its way into the local library's newsletter, not on the front page, but tucked into the column titled Stories That Matter. A high school sophomore had written it for an assignment, quoting his grandfather's words. He didn't speak loud, but he was heard by everyone who needed to listen. At the town's only barbershop, the owner pinned a copy of the article to the bulletin board between an Old Navy football schedule and a faded picture of JFK. A week later, a middle school teacher printed it out and handed it to each student before Veterans Day. They were told they'd read about valor, but in the context of patience, not warfare. In the church down the street, a sermon began not with scripture, but with a line from Victor's story. Sometimes what saves a man isn't glory. It's breakfast on a cold bench and being seen like he matters. Congregants sat longer than usual that morning. Nobody checked their phones. Kids who once skateboarded past the bench now slowed down. Some even stopped. One afternoon, a teenager dismounted, picked up a small flag that had blown loose from the display, and replanted it firmly back in place. He didn't speak, just nodded once at the wooden plaque before riding on. The change wasn't broadcast. It was observed. One neighbor began walking her dog a different route, just to pass the bench. A postal worker started placing notes in mailboxes that read simply, "If you see someone, let them know." At the local diner, a server known for sarcasm began brewing one extra cup of coffee each morning, setting it at the edge of the counter without a word. Victor never acknowledged any of it. He still arrived early, still took the same seat, still said little. But people noticed how he lingered a little longer by the photo now. But sometimes a kid would sit beside him, not to talk, just to be near. And he'd shift slightly, making space. Emily never claimed the legacy either. When asked, she only said, "It was never about a medal. It was about noticing who were trained not to see." And so, the story spread. Slowly, like fog over the coast. Gentle, quiet, but everywhere. A mechanic began offering veterans free oil changes on Fridays. A fourth-grade girl brought her grandfather's Purple Heart for show and tell and whispered, "He knew Mr. Victor." At the library, someone anonymously donated a book titled Grace in Small Gestures, with a napkin tucked inside the cover. One morning, a young boy, no older than 8, stood before the frame outside the bakery. His backpack slipped off his shoulder as he stared at the napkin behind the glass. His mother waited a few steps behind, watching as he reached into his pocket and pressed a folded paper to the glass. It was a drawing. A man with silver hair seated beside a smiling woman holding a tray. And just as the boy turned to leave, the wind caught the flag again. But this time, before it could fall, the boy turned, stepped forward and caught it. He tucked it carefully back into its holder. Then he looked up, once quietly, and walked on. Some stories don't need to be told loudly to live forever. The wind had quieted. The sun dipped lower, casting a soft gold across the storefront window of the bakery, where the old bench remained, scrubbed clean, a new plank fitted beneath its seat, and above it, a simple brass plaque now shone in the late light. "Every breakfast is a salute." Beneath it, the original napkin, yellowed but protected in glass, still bore Victor's handwriting. "Thank you for seeing me as a person." That morning, Emily arrived before dawn, her apron already dusted in flour, and placed one extra pastry on the bench beside a folded napkin, as always. But this time she paused and looked up. Across the street, a teenage boy waiting for the school bus met her eyes. He didn't smile. He just raised his hand slowly and nodded. Inside, no one spoke. Even the mixer stayed quiet. Customers entered, lowered their voices, and left a few extra dollars at the tip jar marked Quiet Table Fund. A little girl left a flower beside the bench without saying a word. And when the Marines came by, not in uniform, but in jeans and old boots, they never walked past the bench without touching the plaque. Some with fingers, some with their eyes. Victor never returned to sit on it. But he was there, in every folded napkin, in every hand that reached out, in every silence that made room for someone else's dignity. Emily once said, "Some people earn their medals. Others just carry their weight without asking to be seen. But when you see them, really see them, something in the world shifts." If you've ever believed that kindness, quiet, persistent, invisible kindness, can be the highest form of honor, then type respect below and tell us who you've seen that others might overlook. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told again and again, not for the views, not for the noise, but to remember who we are when no one's watching, then stay. Subscribe. Be part of a place where silence still holds power, and every story is a folded napkin waiting to be read.